They called him a coward the moment he chose not to draw, and in a place like Dry Creek, a man's silence could weigh heavier than a loaded gun. The sun hung high and merciless above the town, bleaching the color out of everything. Out of the cracked wooden storefronts, out of the dust that drifted like smoke across the main street, out of the faces that had already decided what kind of man Ethan Cole was supposed to be. He stood there with his hat pulled low, the brim casting a shadow over eyes that did not move with the noise around him, not with the murmurs, not with the laughter that came sharp and quick like dry twigs snapping under a boot. Somewhere behind him, a rope creaked softly in the wind, not loud enough to demand attention, but present enough to remind everyone what kind of afternoon this was meant to become. Dry Creek did not wait for truth, it waited for agreement. And agreement came easy when fear wore the same face in every mirror. A man near the saloon porch spat into the dirt and said it again, louder this time, making sure it stuck. Coward, like the word itself could settle the matter, like it could fill in all the blanks no one bothered to ask about. Ethan did not turn, did not answer, and that was the part that sealed it for them. Because out here, a man who refused to explain himself was either guilty or afraid, and they had already chosen which one felt better to believe. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sun-warmed leather. And something older, something that came from beyond the ridge to the west, where the land dipped and rose again in long, quiet lines that most men in town never bothered to study. Ethan's gaze lingered there for half a second too long for it to mean nothing. Then he reached up, adjusted his hat with a slow, deliberate motion, and stepped off the packed dirt of the street as if he were leaving behind something lighter than dust but heavier than judgment. Boots pressed into the ground, each step measured, unhurried, not the walk of a man running from anything, but not the walk of a man trying to prove something either. Behind him, the voices grew sharper, filling the space he left behind, turning his absence into a story they could shape however they pleased. Someone laughed. Another voice muttered that it figured, that men like him always folded when it counted. And the word came again, louder, carried farther this time, bouncing off the wood and glass and empty spaces between buildings until it seemed like the whole town had spoken at once. Ethan did not look back. The sun climbed a little higher, then began its slow descent, and in the space between those two movements, something shifted in the air, not enough for most to notice, but enough for the dust to change direction, enough for the shadows to stretch just a little longer than they should have, enough for the quiet beyond Dry Creek to start moving toward it, one silent mile at a time. The town did not move on after he left, it tightened instead, like a rope pulled one notch closer without anyone saying a word about it. The heat settled heavier over Dry Creek, pressing down on shoulders and tempers alike, and the space Ethan had occupied seemed to linger in the dust, as if his absence had shape, had weight, had something unfinished hanging in it. Sheriff Wallace stood near the center of the street with his thumbs hooked loosely in his belt, a man trying to look certain in front of eyes that demanded certainty, though his gaze drifted more often than it should have toward the western ridge, toward that same line Ethan had studied before walking away. Not many noticed that detail, but a few did, the quiet ones, the ones who had lived long enough to recognize when a man was not retreating but measuring. Near the edge of the square, Ayanna remained where they had placed her, hands bound but posture unbroken, her eyes not on the rope that swayed gently in the breeze, not on the townspeople who avoided looking at her for too long, but on the empty stretch of road Ethan had taken, as if she was listening for something no one else knew to hear. A woman in a faded blue dress muttered that it was better this way, that trouble left with men like him, and a few nodded because agreement felt safer than doubt. Yet even as they spoke, the wind carried a low, distant rhythm that did not belong to the town, something too steady to be chance, too measured to be dismissed as imagination. Horses, though no one said it out loud, not yet, because naming it would mean admitting that the day was not going to end the way they had planned. Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat, the sound dry and thin, and gestured vaguely as if to continue what had already been set in motion, but his voice did not follow through with the command. It stalled somewhere behind his teeth, caught between what he thought he controlled and what he was beginning to sense slipping beyond him. The shadows stretched longer across the street, crawling up the wooden posts, slipping beneath boots, touching everything with a cooler edge that hinted at the coming evening, and with it, something else, something that made the air feel different, less certain, less owned. A boy near the water trough squinted toward the horizon, his small hand shielding his eyes. And for a moment, he forgot what he had been told to believe about cowards and courage, because what he saw did not match the story he had been given. Dust, rising in a thin, deliberate line from the west, not scattered, not wandering, but moving with purpose, as if guided by something older than the town itself. Ayana's breathing slowed, not with fear, but with recognition, the kind that settles deep in the chest when a truth finally begins to arrive, somewhere behind the buildings. A loose shutter tapped once, twice, then fell still, and in that brief quiet, the rhythm grew clearer, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, a steady approach that turned every listening ear toward the same horizon Ethan had chosen before any of them understood why. And still, no one spoke his name, not yet, because the weight of that silence was beginning to change, shifting from judgment into something far more difficult to hold on to, something that felt a lot like doubt. The first rider appeared as a shadow against the falling light, small at first, almost mistaken for a trick of the eye, until the shape held steady and grew with every passing second, followed by another, then another, until the line stretched along the ridge like a quiet answer no one in Dry Creek had asked for out loud. No one moved to greet them, no one stepped forward, because something in their approach did not feel like a threat, and did not feel like a welcome either. It felt measured, deliberate, like a message carried across miles of open land without the need for a single raised voice. Sheriff Wallace straightened, though the motion came late and lacked the certainty he had worn earlier, his hand hovering near his belt not out of readiness, but out of habit, as if routine could steady what the moment had already unsettled. The riders did not rush, did not break formation, their horses moving at a steady pace that matched the slowing heartbeat of the town itself, each step stirring the dust and soft, rising clouds that caught the orange glow of the setting sun. Ayana lifted her chin slightly, her eyes following the lead figure as it descended from the ridge, and for the first time since she had been brought to the square, something like calm settled into her expression, not relief, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes before words ever have a chance to form. A murmur spread through the crowd, quieter than before, less certain, as if the same voices that had spoken so loudly earlier now found themselves unsure of what story they were supposed to tell next. The lead rider reached the edge of town and slowed, the horse coming to a near stop with a controlled ease that spoke of long roads and steady hands. And it was then that a few of the older men exchanged glances, not because they recognized the rider, but because they recognized the posture, the silence, the way authority could exist without being announced. Behind him, the others followed suit, forming a loose line that did not close in and did not retreat, simply present, simply there, their presence filling the space in a way that shifted the balance of everything that had come before. The wind carried the faint sound of leather and reins, of hooves settling into the dirt, of breath that came calm and even, and beneath it all, something else, something quieter still, the absence of fear where fear had been expected. Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat again, louder this time, as if volume alone might return control to his side of the street, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the weight of what stood before him. Then, from the center of that line, a figure moved forward, not fast, not dramatic, just one rider easing ahead of the rest, and as the light caught his face beneath the brim of his hat, a shift passed through the crowd like a ripple across still water, subtle but undeniable. Ethan Cole had not left them after all. He had returned, and he had not returned alone, yet he carried no weapon in his hands, no sign of challenge in his posture, only that same steady stillness he had worn when he chose to walk away, now heavier, now clearer, now impossible to mistake for weakness. He brought his horse to a stop a few yards from the square, his gaze moving once across the gathered faces, not accusing, not searching, simply seeing, and in that quiet moment, the word they had used for him earlier seemed to lose its shape, its certainty, its place in the air between them, replaced by something none of them were ready to name just yet. Ethan did not speak when he stopped, and that was the first thing that unsettled them. Not the riders behind him, not the dust still settling around their boots, but the absence of words where words were expected, where words would have made this simple again. Sheriff Wallace shifted his weight and forced a half step forward, the kind of movement meant to reclaim ground that no longer felt like his, and his voice came out rougher than before, asking a question that sounded more like a demand than a greeting, what this meant, why he had come back, why he had brought them here. But Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes moving past the sheriff, past the rope, past the crowd that had filled itself with certainty only an hour ago, until they came to rest on Ayanna. For a moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the noise, the tension, the unspoken expectations, and in that stillness there was no fear in her posture, no plea in her expression, only a quiet understanding that passed between them without needing shape or sound. Ethan reached slowly into his coat, not with urgency, not with any motion that could be mistaken for threat, and several men tensed anyway, hands hovering where they thought power lived, but he brought out only a small object, something dull against the light until he turned it just enough for the sun to catch its edge, metal, worn, marked with a symbol that did not belong to the Apache riders, did not belong to the open land beyond the ridge, but belonged to Dry Creek itself. He held it there for a second, letting the silence stretch, letting the recognition find its way into the faces that had gathered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying just far enough without ever rising. He said he had found it half a mile west of the Henderson place, in the dust where no one from town had bothered to look, and he said it without accusation, without weight added to the words, as if the truth did not need help to stand on its own. A murmur moved through the crowd again, different this time, less certain, more searching, and Sheriff Wallace's gaze dropped for the briefest moment before lifting again, sharper now, narrower, as if trying to measure something that no longer fit within his understanding. Ethan let the object fall from his hand, not thrown, not forced, just released, and it landed softly in the dirt between them, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, because of what it carried. No one stepped forward to pick it up right away, no one claimed it, and in that hesitation, something shifted, the weight of the afternoon leaning in a different direction. Behind Ethan, the riders remained still, not pressing, not advancing, their presence unchanged. Yet the balance they brought was undeniable, like a line drawn in the dust that no one had seen until it was already there. Ayanna lowered her gaze briefly to the object on the ground, then back to Ethan, and for the first time, the tension in her shoulders eased, just enough to be seen by those who were paying attention, just enough to mark the beginning of something turning. The sun dipped lower, brushing the edge of the horizon with a deep, quiet glow, and in that light, the story the town had built began to thin, its edges fraying under the weight of something far simpler and far harder to ignore. No one used the word they had used before, not now, not with the truth lying in the dust between them, not with the man they had dismissed standing exactly where he needed to be, saying only what mattered and nothing more. No one bent down at first, not even the sheriff, not even the men who had spoken the loudest when certainty had been easy, because the small piece of metal in the dust had changed something they could not easily put back into place. It lay there catching the last stretch of sunlight, its worn edges familiar in a way that made a few faces tighten, not from recognition alone, but from the quiet understanding of what that recognition meant. Sheriff Wallace finally stepped forward, slower than a man who believed he was in control, and when he crouched to pick it up, the movement felt heavier than it should have, like lifting more than just an object, like lifting a truth that did not belong to him. He turned it once in his hand, then again, as if hoping the shape might change, but it did not, and when he looked up, his eyes did not go to Ethan first. They went to the edge of the crowd where Deputy Harris stood, a man who had kept himself just far enough back to avoid attention until this moment forced it upon him. Harris did not move right away, and that stillness spoke louder than anything he could have said, the kind of stillness that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him has shifted without warning. The crowd followed the sheriff's gaze, one head turning, then another, until the focus settled where it had not been before, and the space around Harris seemed to widen as if the town itself were stepping back from him without taking a single step. Ethan remained where He was, his posture unchanged, his hands empty, offering nothing more than what he had already placed between them. And in that restraint there was a weight that pressed harder than any accusation could have. Ayanna watched the exchange with a quiet steadiness, her eyes moving from the badge in the sheriff's hand to the man, now standing alone at the edge of what had once been a unified front, and something in her expression shifted, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a calm that came from the simple alignment of truth with what she had carried all along. Sheriff Wallace stood slowly, the badge still in his grip, and for a moment, he looked like a man caught between two versions of himself, the one who had followed the easier path and the one now forced to see where that path had led. The wind moved through the street again, softer now, carrying with it the fading heat of the day and the first hint of evening cool. And in that change, the voices that had once filled the space fell away, replaced by a silence that felt earned rather than imposed. Harris took a step back, then stopped, as if unsure where retreat would lead him, and no one moved to follow, no one moved to support, because the certainty that had held them together had already begun to dissolve. Ethan finally shifted his gaze from Ayanna to the sheriff, not demanding, not instructing, simply waiting, and in that waiting there was a kind of respect, not for what had been done, but for what could still be chosen. The sun dipped lower, touching the edge of the horizon, and the light stretched long across the ground, catching the badge once more before it slipped into shadow, and in that moment, the story of the day changed without a single raised voice, without a single forceful act, only the quiet, undeniable presence of what had always been there, waiting for someone willing enough to walk away long enough to find it. The last light of day settled low across Dry Creek, stretching shadows long and thin like quiet reminders of everything that had been said too quickly and believed too easily. And in that fading glow, Sheriff Wallace stood with the badge still resting in his palm, its weight no longer small, no longer simple, but something that pressed into his hand with a truth he could not ignore. He looked once more at Deputy Harris, and this time there was no hesitation in his gaze, only the slow, steady recognition of a mistake that had been allowed to grow because it had been easier than asking questions. Harris shifted again, his boots scraping lightly against the dirt, and though he opened his mouth as if to speak, no words came that could carry him out of what had already been uncovered. The town watched, not with the hunger it had shown earlier, but with something quieter, something closer to reflection. As if each face was measuring its own place in what had almost happened. Ethan did not move, did not press forward, did not claim anything that was unfolding. And in that restraint there was a kind of space being offered, a chance for the moment to resolve without force, without noise. Ayanna stood still as well, her eyes calm now, no longer searching the horizon, no longer bracing for what might come, but present, fully present in a moment that had finally begun to align with what she had known from the beginning. The rope that had once swayed in the afternoon heat now hung motionless, forgotten in the shift of attention, its purpose dissolved not by action, but by the simple arrival of truth. Sheriff Wallace took a breath, slow and deliberate, and then stepped toward Ayanna, not as a man asserting control, but as someone choosing, carefully, what kind of man he would be when this day was remembered. His hands moved with care as he loosened the bindings, the gesture quiet, almost hesitant, as if aware that the smallest movement now carried more meaning than any command he could have given earlier. The crowd did not cheer, did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that would not feel smaller than what had just occurred. The wind moved again, cooler now, carrying with it the first hints of night, brushing against faces that had lost their certainty and found something else in its place. Behind Ethan, the riders remained still, their presence unchanged, not claiming victory, not demanding acknowledgement, simply bearing witness to a moment that had corrected itself without the need for force. Ethan's gaze shifted once more, taking in the town, the sheriff, the man who now stood apart from the rest, and finally returning to the horizon where the sun slipped fully below the line of the land, leaving behind a quiet that felt deeper than before. He turned his horse slightly, not in retreat, not in departure born of avoidance, but in the calm understanding that what needed to be done had been done, and that staying longer would not add to it. Ayanna watched him for a brief second, then inclined her head just enough to be seen. a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no debt, only respect. And in that small exchange, something passed between them that did not need to be named. The town remained still as Ethan guided his horse away. From the square, the riders behind him beginning to move in the same quiet formation they had arrived in, their figures blending slowly into the deepening blue of the evening. And as the last trace of sunlight disappeared, what remained in Dry Creek was not the echo of a word spoken in judgment, but the weight of a silence that had learned, too late for pride, but not too late for change, that a man does not always stand his ground to prove his courage. Sometimes he walks away so that truth can find its way back. The night did not fall all at once over Dry Creek. It settled in slowly, like a truth the town had to sit with whether it wanted to or not. And long after the riders had disappeared beyond the western ridge, their presence remained, not in sight, but in the way the air had changed, in the way no one raised their voice again, in the way even the smallest sounds seemed to carry farther than they should. The rope still hung from the beam in the square, untouched, swaying just enough in the evening breeze to remind everyone how close they had come to letting something irreversible define them, and no one stepped forward to take it down, not because they did not see it, but because they did, and seeing it meant acknowledging what it had almost been used for. Sheriff Wallace stood alone near the center of the street now, the badge no longer in his hand, but resting somewhere unseen, as if putting it away might make its weight easier to carry, though the look in his eyes suggested otherwise. Suggested a man who would remember this day longer than any of the others. The townspeople began to drift back toward their homes, slow at first, then in ones and twos, not speaking much, not needing to, each step quieter than the ones before, as if the ground itself had changed under them, as if it demanded a different kind of presence now. Ayanna remained for a moment longer than the rest, standing where she had been freed, her gaze moving once across the emptying street, taking in the buildings, the faces that no longer met her eyes, the silence that had replaced judgment, and then she turned toward the same road Ethan had taken, not following, not chasing, simply acknowledging the direction of something that had been set right. A boy near the trough, the same one who had watched the horizon earlier, looked down at his hands as if trying to understand how something so small as a word could have held so much weight, and how quickly that weight could shift when truth arrived without asking permission. Somewhere a door closed, not slammed, not hurried, just closed with care, and another followed, and then another, until the town settled into a quiet that felt different from any night before, not empty, but full of something unspoken. The stars began to show above the ridge, one by one, faint at first, then clearer as the last light faded completely, and in that wide, open sky there was no sign of what had nearly happened. No trace of the voices that had filled the afternoon, only the steady presence of something larger, something that did not bend to fear or haste. Sheriff Wallace finally moved, walking to the beam where the rope hung, and, after a long moment, he reached up and pulled it down, not as a gesture for anyone else, but as something he needed to do for himself, something that would not undo the day but might keep it from repeating. The rope coiled loosely in his hands, lighter now, useless in a way that felt right, and he carried it away without looking back. By the time the moon rose over Dry Creek, there was no one left in the square, no sound but the wind moving through the empty street, and yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt marked, like a story had passed through it and left something behind that would not fade with the dust. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where the land stretched quiet and open under the same sky, a man rode on without needing to hear what they would say about him tomorrow, because out here, the truth did not need to be spoken twice. It only needed one man willing to walk away long enough to bring it back. Morning came to Dry Creek without announcement. No rooster call loud enough to shake what had settled into the town overnight. Only a pale stretch of light slipping over the ridge and touching the empty street where yesterday still lingered in ways no one could sweep away. The dust lay undisturbed, holding faint impressions of boots and hooves that had already become part of something larger than memory. And the wooden beam in the square stood bare now, its purpose removed, its presence quieter, almost ashamed of what it had nearly been used for. Sheriff Wallace stepped out onto the porch of his office earlier than usual, his hat resting low, his movements slower, as if the weight he carried had followed him into sleep and refused to leave when the sun returned. He looked across the street not as a man surveying his town, but as someone seeing it for the first time without the comfort of certainty. And in that gaze there was no authority, only responsibility settling in where pride had once been. A few doors opened along the street, one at a time, people stepping out into the morning with cautious glances, not toward each other, but toward the space where everything had changed. And though no one spoke of it yet, the absence of yesterday's voices was louder than any conversation could have been. Near the water trough, the same boy stood again, tracing the ground with the toe of his boot, following the faint outline where a line of riders had once passed. And for him, the story had already shifted into something quieter, something that did not need to be repeated to be understood. Ayana was no longer in the square, no longer in sight. But her presence remained in the way the town moved differently, in the way no one reached for easy answers this morning, and in the way a few eyes lingered longer than before on the western horizon, not with suspicion, but with a kind of respect they had not known how to hold before. The wind carried a different scent now, less of heat, more of open land beyond the ridge, as if the boundary between the town and everything outside it had thinned just enough to let something honest pass through. Sheriff Wallace stepped down from the porch and walked slowly across the street, stopping where the rope had once hung, his gaze lowering to the ground where nothing marked the place except the memory of what had almost been decided there. And after a long moment, he removed his badge and held it in his hand, turning it once, not to question it, but to understand what it demanded from him now. The town continued to wake around him, quiet, measured, as if learning a new rhythm that did not rely on noise or certainty. And somewhere beyond the ridge, far enough that no one could see but close enough to feel, a rider moved across the open land, steady, unhurried, not looking back because there was nothing left behind that needed his presence anymore. The sun climbed higher, warming the boards, the dust, the faces that had softened overnight. And though Dry Creek would speak again, would return to its routines and its habits, something beneath it had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. And in that morning light, with no words spoken and no one claiming what had happened, the town carried forward a quiet understanding that courage does not always stand in the center of a crowd. Sometimes it walks away from it, and in doing so, leaves behind a space where truth can finally be seen for what it is. By mid-morning, the rhythm of Dry Creek had begun to return, but it did not sound the same as before. The usual clatter of boots on wood and low reservoir of voices carried a hesitation now, as if each word had to pass through a quieter kind of thinking before it was allowed into the air. The general store opened its doors, and men gathered out front not in loud clusters, but in small, spaced groups, speaking in lower tones, glancing occasionally toward the sheriff's office, toward the square, toward the western ridge where nothing could be seen but everything could still be felt. Sheriff Wallace remained near the center of town longer than he normally would, the badge once again pinned to his chest, though it seemed to sit differently there, not as a symbol of authority, but as something earned again, something that would have to be carried with more care than before. He spoke briefly to a few men, his words measured, fewer than usual, and when questions came, he did not answer them quickly, choosing instead to let silence do some of the work that had once been rushed past. Deputy Harris was nowhere to be seen, and no one asked where he had gone, because the absence answered enough on its own, leaving a space that no one seemed eager to fill. The boy by the trough had moved on, now sitting on the edge of the wooden rail with a piece of string in his hands, tying and untying it slowly, as if practicing something he did not yet have the words for, while his eyes still wandered now and then toward the west, drawn by something that had changed inside him without asking permission. A woman swept the front of her home with steady strokes, the dust rising and falling in soft patterns that caught the sunlight. And though her movements were the same as any other morning, there was a gentleness to them now, a care that had not been there before, as if even the ground deserved a different kind of attention. A wagon rolled through town at a slow pace, its wheels creaking softly, and the driver tipped his hat to no one in particular, just a quiet gesture that seemed to belong to the moment more than to any person. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant water, faint but present, and, With it came a reminder that the world beyond Dry Creek had not changed at all, that it had always been steady, always been honest, waiting only for those willing to meet it without rushing to judgment. Sheriff Wallace finally stepped back onto his porch, pausing at the threshold as if marking a line between what had been and what might be now. And before going inside, he turned once more toward the open land beyond the ridge, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging, somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the town's voice, a rider continued on a path that did not need recognition to hold its value. And though no one in Dry Creek would speak of it openly, not yet, the understanding had already taken root, quiet and firm, that what they had witnessed was not weakness, not retreat, but something far rarer, a kind of strength that did not need to stand in the center to be seen, because it had already done what it came to do and left the rest behind for others to carry forward. By late afternoon, the town had settled into something that almost resembled normal, yet beneath it there remained a quiet awareness that could not be undone, like a faint scar beneath the surface of the day, unseen unless you knew where to look. The sun leaned west again, tracing the same path it had the day before, but Dry Creek did not meet it the same way this time. The men on the porch of the general store spoke slower, their laughter shorter, their eyes less certain of the stories they chose to believe. Sheriff Wallace spent most of the day moving through the town without urgency, stopping where needed, listening more than speaking. And when he reached the edge of the square again, he paused in the same spot where everything had shifted, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect for what had taken place there. A few of the townspeople noticed and followed his gaze, not because they were told to, but because something in them had learned to look twice before deciding. The boy who had been by the trough earlier now stood beside his father, asking a question too quiet to be heard, and the man, instead of brushing it aside, crouched down and answered slowly, choosing his words with care, as if aware that what he said now would shape more than just the moment. Across the street, a woman hung laundry on a line, the fabric catching the warm light as it swayed gently, and for a brief second the movement resembled the rope that had once hung there, but softer, harmless, a reminder that not everything that sways in the wind carries the same meaning. A rider passed through town heading east, a stranger, unnoticed by most, yet the sound of hooves drew a few heads toward the road out of instinct, out of something that had been planted the day before, and though nothing followed, the habit of looking remained. Sheriff Wallace reached into his pocket and brought out the badge again, not to display it, not to show it, but simply to hold it for a moment, turning it between his fingers the way a man might turn a thought over in his mind, weighing it, understanding it. Before placing it back where it belonged, the wind shifted once more, carrying with it the long stretch of evening air, and as the shadows began to grow, the town did not brace itself this time, did not tighten, but seemed to accept the coming dusk with a steadier breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge, far beyond the reach of voices and judgments, a lone rider moved through the fading light, his figure small against the open land. Yet the path he followed felt larger than any trail marked on a map, because it had already changed something behind him without needing to return. And as the sun lowered once more toward the horizon, Dry Creek stood quieter than it had in years, not empty, not broken, but aware. Aware that the measure of a man is not always found in the moment he stands before others, but often in the moment he chooses to step away, trusting that truth, if given enough space, will find its way back stronger than any voice that tried to define it. As the second evening approached, Dry Creek did not gather in the square the way it once would have. There was no pull toward spectacle, no quiet hunger for something to happen. Instead, there was distance, space left intentionally between people, as if each man and woman had begun to understand the cost of standing too close to certainty. The sun lowered again, familiar in its path, yet different in its meaning, casting long amber light across the same boards and windows that had witnessed the day before, but now those surfaces seemed to hold that memory differently, not as a stain, but as a lesson pressed into the grain. Sheriff Wallace stood outside his office once more, though this time he did not remain alone for long. A few townspeople approached him, not with demands, not with accusations, but with questions asked carefully, as if they were testing something new, and he answered them the same way, slowly, honestly, without filling silence just to avoid it. One man admitted he had shouted the loudest the day before, his voice now lower, almost uncertain, and Wallace did not rebuke him, did not correct him, only listened, because sometimes listening carried more weight than any judgment. Across the street, the general store owner rearranged goods on his shelf, placing items back where they belonged, a small act of order that mirrored something deeper, trying to settle within the town itself. The boy by the trough had stopped tying his string, now holding it still in his hands as he watched the sun descend, and beside him, his father stood quietly, not offering answers this time, only sharing the view, allowing the moment to speak for itself. A soft wind moved through the street, lifting dust just enough to catch the light, and for a brief instant, the air shimmered in a way that reminded more than one person of the riders who had come and gone without raising a voice, without asking for anything in return. Ayana's absence was felt more clearly now, not as a void, but as a presence that had passed through and left something behind, something that did not belong to one side or the other, but to the space between them, where understanding had finally begun to take shape. Sheriff Wallace reached up and adjusted his hat, a small gesture, but one that came with a steadiness that had not been there before, and as he looked out over the town, there was no need to search the horizon this time, because what mattered was no longer out there. It was here, in the way people held themselves, in the way they chose their words, in the way they allowed silence to exist, without rushing to fill it. The sun touched the edge of the land once more, and as it did, a few of the townspeople turned instinctively toward the west, not expecting riders, not fearing them, but acknowledging the place where something had changed them. And as the light faded into evening, Dry Creek stood not as it had been, but as something quieter, something steadier, a town that had learned, without needing to be told again, that truth does not arrive through force or noise, it arrives in stillness, carried by those who are willing to walk away long enough to let it be seen. On the third evening, Dry Creek did not wait for the sun to remind it what had changed. The understanding had settled deeper now, no longer tied to a single moment or a single place, but woven quietly into the way people moved, spoke, and chose what to believe. The square remained open and ordinary, no crowd gathering, no tension building, just the soft rhythm of a town learning to exist without needing to prove itself at every turn. Sheriff Wallace walked its length once more, slower than before, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, as if each step carried thought behind it, and when he reached the center, he did not stop because he had to. He stopped because he wanted to remember exactly where things had shifted, not to dwell on it, but to keep it from fading into something easier than it had been. A few lanterns flickered to life along the street as dusk approached, their light warm and steady, casting small circles that did not reach far, but did not need to. And within those circles, conversations took place that would not have happened days earlier, quieter exchanges, questions asked without the need to dominate the answer, moments where listening held equal weight to speaking. The general store owner stood outside his door with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the street not as a place of business, but as a place that now required a different kind of care, his eyes following the movement of others with a patience that had not been there before. The boy who once traced the dust now sat beside the trough again. But this time he was not tying knots, he was simply watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer pulled by confusion, but guided by something quieter, something closer to understanding. His father stood nearby, not correcting him, not instructing him, allowing the silence between them to carry what words might have complicated. The wind moved through Dry Creek again, steady, familiar, yet now it seemed to belong to both the town and the land beyond it, no longer divided by fear or assumption, but shared in a way that had not been possible before. Sheriff Wallace reached the porch of his office and paused, his hand resting briefly against the wooden post, feeling the texture beneath his fingers, grounding himself in something simple and real. And for a moment he looked west, not searching, not expecting, but acknowledging, the same quiet acknowledgement that had passed through the town more than once now. No riders appeared, no dust rose along the ridge, and yet the absence did not feel empty, it felt complete, as if nothing more needed to arrive for the lesson to remain. A door closed gently somewhere behind him, another lantern lit, another voice lowered, and the town settled once again into evening, not as it had before, but as something steadier, something that no longer relied on certainty to feel whole. And as the last light slipped beneath the horizon, Dry Creek held on to what it had learned without needing to repeat it, without needing to name it, because some truths do not ask to be spoken aloud. They ask only to be carried forward, quietly, in the choices that follow. The days that followed did not erase what had happened in Dry Creek. They settled around it, shaped by it, like the land shaped itself around a river that had once cut through it with quiet persistence, leaving behind something that could not be smoothed away. The town moved forward, as all towns do, but it did so with a steadier rhythm now, one that did not rush to fill silence or cling to the comfort of quick judgment. And in that change there was something lasting, something that would not fade with the passing of time. Sheriff Wallace carried himself differently, not in the way he stood, but in the way he paused, in the way he listened before speaking, as if each moment now held more weight than it once had, and those who watched him could see it, even if they did not say it aloud. The square remained open and ordinary, no mark left in the dirt, no sign of what had almost taken place there. And yet everyone who crossed it felt something beneath their steps, a quiet reminder that the ground had once held a choice, and that choice had been changed not by force, but by something far more difficult to summon. The boy by the trough grew quieter in the days that followed, not withdrawn, but thoughtful, his questions fewer, his observations sharper, and when he looked toward the western ridge, it was no longer out of curiosity alone, but out of a kind of respect that had taken root in him without being taught. The adults spoke of other things, work, weather, the slow turning of seasons, but now and then a pause would come, a brief silence in conversation where no one reached to fill it, and in that pause, the memory of that day would pass between them, not as a story to be told, but as something understood, beyond the ridge, far from the town that had once called him something he did not need to answer. A rider continued on his path, the open land stretching wide beneath him, the sky unbroken above, and there was no need for him to return, no need for him to hear what had changed, because the work he had done did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to those who had witnessed it. And back in Dry Creek, as the sun set once more over the quiet street, there was no crowd waiting, no voices rising, only the soft glow of evening settling over a town that had learned, in its own way, that courage is not always the man who stands and fights. Sometimes it is the man who walks away, trusting that truth will follow, and when it does, it will not need to shout, it will only need to be seen.